Hello, and welcome to this lecture where we will discuss mental capacity in horses, or people often think of this as intelligence. So it's worth considering Lord Morgan's canon, who said, "In no case is an animal activity to be interpreted in terms of higher psychological processes if it can be fairly interpreted in terms of processes which stand lower in the scale of psychological evolution and development." So if there is a simple reason for a horse's behaviour, we should use that reason rather than looking for a more complex one, which often involves higher cognitive processes that horses are not capable of. Just as an example, I have heard people say, the horse is just showing me up because he knows I'm competing at a show in front of my friends. He knows how to do it fine at home, but he wants to embarrass me in front of my friends. Well, horses don't really have any concept of embarrassment, and they certainly don't have any intent to want to inflict that emotion on a person. And I think when we talk about mental capacity in horses, we often go wrong in both directions. Not always, I'm being a bit negative there. But I think we need to be careful not to say he knows better, he knows what he's doing, he should know that, and suggest that they, have a moral compass. So, for example, a horse being naughty would require that morally they can think about what is right and wrong, and also be aware of what in our society is considered appropriate and not, and act accordingly. Whereas at the end of the day, they just behave as they're being reinforced. So we shouldn't overestimate a horse's intelligence and say he knows what he's doing wrong, he's just been naughty. But we also shouldn't underestimate it and say he's just a horse, it doesn't matter. They don't feel those emotions. But again, I'm digressing, so let's think through what we do know. So horses' brains make up a very small percentage of their body weight compared to our brains. And in particular, you'll see this pink part at the front is the prefrontal cortex. And horses have a really poorly developed prefrontal cortex. And the consequences of that is that they don't have any imagination. So they don't have this ability to think about things in your mind's eye. And the way that impacts them is that they can't problem solve. So if you are presented with a problem, without physically acting it out, you can think in your head, right, option A would be to do this, and that might happen. Option B would be to do this and that might be the outcome. And option C might be to, option C I think is going to work. So we choose option C. Everything horses learn is through trial and error learning. And they can learn some incredibly complex sequences of events, some very complicated tasks through trial and error learning. But what they can't do is play things out in their mind's eye and think about them. It also means that they can't reflect on things that have happened in the past, and they can't, as we say, plan for the future and think about what might happen if they do this versus if they do that. Horses have an incredible long-term memory, far greater than ours. So if you teach a horse something, they should retain that information for life. You could leave it 20 years and you go back and you ask for the same thing and they know what it is. A good example would be a horse that was taught a circus routine to music. A long period of time, if that music plays, they know what they're meant to be doing in which point. Now, the reason for that is because their brains are quite different to ours. So when we learn something, we learn it in, if you like, the front part of the brain, and then we store it in the back. And then we discuss it with our friends, so it comes to the front to do that, and we start again. And then we think about it when we're going to bed that night, and we replay it in our head, and it goes to the back. And then we discuss it with someone else the next day. And every time it goes back and forth, it's like Chinese whispers, and that message gets a little bit distorted. Whereas for horses, they're not doing that. So when a memory is triggered, they tend to remember things really well. On the other hand, horses have poor short-term memory. So there's a really nice scientific study, and what they did, they took horses into the centre of an arena and stood them, and there'd be a bucket in each corner, and some feed would be tipped into one of the buckets. It was randomised left and right each time. And the horse was released, and if it's the left bucket, this horse would walk across and eat the feed in the left bucket. No problems. What they then started doing was they delayed the period of time between the feed being tipped into the bucket and the horse being released. And once it got to 10 seconds, it became a 50-50 probability whether the horse went to the correct bucket or the incorrect bucket. So that tells us that even when horses are highly motivated to remember something, after 10 seconds they were unable to remember it. And we actually know that for optimal timing, we need to be reinforcing behaviours within half a second. Up to about 2 seconds, you've still got a chance. After that, it becomes much harder. So one of the things that was interesting in this study was they did see some differences. And some of the more thoroughbred types, if they went to the wrong bucket, they just went round to start again. Better luck next time. But there was one pony that always got it right. And every single time, this pony went to the correct bucket. So they thought, well, maybe this pony is more intelligent than the thoroughbreds. Lots of people would believe that. And this is why it's important not to overestimate things until you've proven it. So thankfully what they'd done is they'd filmed all of the horses. They went back and they watched the footage. And you'd have a thoroughbred come in, and the feed was tipped into one of the buckets, and the timer started, and say it was the right bucket it was tipped into, the thoroughbred's looking at the right bucket, and then another horse walks past over here and it looks round at the other horse, and then by the time it's released it doesn't know whether to go left or right. Whereas the pony, if the feed was tipped in the right bucket, it literally just stared at that right bucket. Like a bomb could go off in the distance. Nothing was changing that pony's focus. So that doesn't tell us anything about intelligence. What it tells us is about motivation, and it also tells us about trial and error of a response to increase your success rate. So because of this, we know that horses have a very limited mental capacity compared to us. We need to make their training as easy as possible for them, for us all to succeed. So the first thing to consider is train easy to discriminate signals. And we need to remember that we expect a horse to habituate to pressure from contact with the hand, the leg and the seat, but be responsive to a light aid. And the only difference there is the amount of pressure involved. Some horses are obviously selected to be more sensitive to pressure changes than others, and this is where we can get into problems. So if people buy a horse, we talk about, of course, overhorsing themselves. If people buy a horse that is a little bit more sensitive to cues, and they don't have an independent seat, then sometimes when they're given a rein cue, it means slow down, and sometimes they've just lost their balance and they're using the horse's mouth for balance. But that's really hard for the horse to get their head round, because they're just feeling these pressures that sometimes mean they want them to change what they're doing, and other times don't mean anything. And we also need to remember that we expect horses to adapt to different riders, and every rider will apply their aids slightly differently, slightly different directions, slightly different amount of pressure. So it's actually quite impressive that horses do so well. But what we want to do is we want to train easy to discriminate signals. So I think it's really useful to consider having very different cues for going up or down a gate in a transition, faster and slower variations, longer and shorter variations, turning the forelegs and turning the hind legs, and for head, neck flexions and head carriage. So, if I was to say, how does a horse know the difference between faster and longer, you would have a very different set of aids. And I know there was one elite rider that this was discussed with, and I know they had said, the horse just knows. I give the same cue for faster and longer steps, and the horse just knows which one I want. Well, for me, clearly the rider doesn't know what cues they're giving, because that horse is able to discriminate the difference between those two cues and give the appropriate response. Obviously, as an elite level rider, they're going to be very consistent in how they give those cues, so the horse was able to discriminate it. But for mere mortals like us, I think we need to be very clear in our brains how these cues are different, so we make it easy for horses. So just as an example, and I will say, whenever I'm using examples here, I'm not suggesting this is what we want people to teach, or this is certainly not what the Pony Club are suggesting people teach. I'm just giving an example of how we apply the scientific knowledge in a practical scenario. But you may come up with a completely different one that you want to do yourselves. So when I back young horses, I teach them the difference between faster steps versus longer steps from maybe ride 3, 4, 5, something like that, like really, really early on, just in walk, of course, initially. And I give them really different cues. So if I want the horse to go from a slow walk to a fast walk, I squeeze and I hold with my calf for 2 steps of the front legs, and then the horse is going faster, so I release. If I want the horse to go from walk to trot, I squeeze and hold, but it's a bigger squeeze, because going up a gate is the same as going faster, it's just more of it. So light squeeze with the calves means go a little bit faster, bigger squeeze means go up a gate. Now if I want the horse to go from the walk it's in into a longer walk, rather than squeeze with my calf, I use my heel and I give a tiny tap with my heel, and I don't kind of tap and hold because that would be a squeeze. So I give a tiny tap every 3rd step. So you think the horse's front legs, I go 1, 2, tap, 1, 2, tap, and that means I'm alternating whether the right or left foreleg is going forwards. And the horses start to swing a little bit more, and then of course I stop tapping, and the horse knows a light hold and squeeze means go a little bit faster. A little tap every 3rd step means to lengthen my stride. And like I say, when I'm backing young horses, I teach this in walk really nicely. So then when I come into trot and I want to start asking for some lengthened strides, the horse already knows what that button is. So I'm just finding a way to make it really easy for the horse to give the right response. We should only train one response per signal. So only reinforce one response for every separate signal. However, each response can be elicited by more than one signal. Now, people might get confused about this initially, so let's use a different example. If I wanted an apple, I would ask for an apple. If I was in France, I would use the French word. If I was in Germany, I would use the German word. So there are many different ways of asking for an apple, but fundamentally the response is still that I want an apple. However, if I wanted an apple, and let's just stay with the English language. If I wanted an apple, and sometimes I said I want an apple, and sometimes I said I wanted a banana, and sometimes I said I wanted an orange, but then I got annoyed if someone brought me a banana or an orange because I wanted an apple, that would be really confusing. So with horses, we only, a specific leg cue should only ever mean one response. It shouldn't sometimes mean longer, sometimes mean faster, for example. But you can have more than one way. So again, sometimes we may use verbal cues when backing young horses. So I may squeeze and hold, or I may say walk on. Both of those things want the same response, but there are different ways of asking for it. And I think for me, if we really try and make it simple for horses, whenever I'm applying pressure from both my legs, that always involves some sort of response from the horse about go. So it may be go faster, go up a gate, or go longer. And so my legs may be slightly different aids, but it's still both legs. If I'm applying pressure from both hands, that's involved with stop, back, slow, shorten, or down a gate. And again, slightly difference in variations in my seat and everything else. But fundamentally, both hands is always involved with stepping backwards or slowing down because they're the same muscles that are involved. If I just give pressure from one rein, that should be eliciting a turn response. And if I just use pressure from one of my legs behind the girth, that should elicit the hindquarters to step sideways. So then I'm breaking it down into these really easy patterns for the horse to understand. So the pitfalls that we want to avoid, we don't want to use the same signal and expect different responses. So as I've said already, you can't say use your leg for faster and use it for longer steps unless you're clear how your leg and your seat is being used differently. We really want to use backwards pressure on both reins to be involved with slowing or shortening the stride or stepping backwards. And we want to avoid using rein pressure to put the horse in vertical flexion, because then when someone tries to slow the horse, they can just go in vertical flexion and still continue to run away with them. So obviously we can use it's kind of a bit beyond the scope of these lectures, but use a different series of exercises to get the horse's body in the position that we want, and that really comes from getting the horse's back in the position that we want, and then they tend to be in vertical flexion anyway, and then we can just tweak it a little bit more with the hand. And I think it's really important to have different cues for acceleration versus deceleration. I think we just need to make that really simple for the horse. What else do we need to consider with regards to mental capacity? Well, horses have what we call context-specific learning. So we may take a young horse to a cross-country course and we may take it through the water and think we've trained the horse to go into water. We haven't. We've trained it to go into that water on that day in those weather conditions with that rider on its back. Now, some horses go, yep, I understand water now, I get water. But on average, we're looking at about 5 different times before the horse, 5 different water complexes before the horse goes, oh yeah, it's water, I get water. The common factor here is this wet stuff. I know what to do now. And it's a similar thing, if people practice loading at home in a calm, quiet environment and then expect that the horse will load perfectly at a show when there's lots more going on. They've trained the horse to load at home when the horse box is parked that way, and there's all these other things going on. And if I'm dealing with problematic loaders, we retrain them to load where they are, and then I say, right, once that's established, park your lorry the other way, park it in a different part of the yard. Let's make sure that moving the lorry doesn't change the horse's response. Same for things like if you're teaching length and strides. People will only train them going across the diagonal in their arena at home, and then when it doesn't work in competition, they go, oh, the horse is being naughty. But actually, sometimes the horse has learnt that they only offer that behaviour when they're going across the diagonal, which usually doesn't involve the spooky corner in the arena at home. Whereas actually, if they also do it on the long side and they also do a few strides out hacking, then the common factor is the cues mean length and strides. So after this, we're going to go on to talk about learning theory. And horses have a fairly limited mental capacity when it comes to learning theory. So they can understand the first 5 levels, and again, we'll talk through this in more detail next time, but they're not capable of these higher cognitive processes, which again just reminds us that we should never interpret behaviours, and it's usually problematic behaviours, in terms of higher psychological processes if we can explain it easily with ones that are lower on the psychological evolution and development scale. And then we'll just finish off with a word on instinct. So instinct is part of the horse's genetic makeup. The startle response is an involuntary reaction to a sudden or threatening stimuli. I'm sure as children we all enjoyed hiding behind doors and jumping out in front of someone. And what you get is rapid contraction followed by extension of the limbs, regardless of whether that's a person or a horse or a dog or a cat. They can be quite dramatic. You land base wide, and these things are really hard to capture, of course, on camera and video to get still, so I haven't got a good image. So this is my first attempt at using AI to create an image, and it's not bad. It's not quite what I'd want, but it's not far off. But the key thing is, this horse was perhaps stood normally and stood square, and then we get this base wide stance, slightly rocked back, ready to then flee in a different direction. We also get this rapid increase in heart rate and adrenaline. So we've all been in that scenario where the horse suddenly startles or suddenly sees something that it's fearful of, and then we can feel the heart beating through the saddle and you think, oh dear, this isn't great, I need to do something about this. And, spooking and bolting in anxious horses can be an involuntary response initially. So it's almost like an exaggerated startle. It's just, you just start to try and run to protect yourselves. So if we think back to, obviously we don't have any truly wild horses anymore, but the Przewalski horses are the closest genetically that we have. their response to threat, well, first of all, it's always to avoid conflict and potential danger. If you've got to a scenario where you're galloping away, then you've got yourself into a scenario you didn't want to do, so you avoid areas that may be problematic for you, and you only flee as a last resort. I guess as your second resort. Fighting would be the last resort, and horses haven't really adapted well for fighting. So they haven't got horns like cattle have. So early detection of potential threats is important. And then the last thing we discuss on instinct, there are certain behavioural patterns that are a preset sequence of behaviours, and these can be triggered. So, for example, when a stallion sees a mare in season, obviously we've got the phlegm response where they're picking up on the pheromones that are being released by the mare, telling them he's in season. But also notice she's got a base wide stance behind, her tail is out to the side, and she's looking round to the side slightly. That's an important cue for stallions to say that this mare is receptive to mating when they turn their head round. I think it's sometimes a problem when we twitch them for mating that the stallions are not getting the normal cues they would do. So this sequence of behaviours in the mare triggers a set action pattern in the stallion of mating. And it's a similar thing with a herd flight response. If you're part of a herd and the others start galloping flat out, you start galloping flat out. If you don't, from an evolutionary perspective, you are more likely to be the one that gets eaten by the lions, and therefore you're not passing on your genetics. So horses, if everything starts going, their instinct is just to run with the rest of them as the first response and think about it afterwards. So in summary, horses really do have quite limited mental capacity, and I know they can achieve some amazing things and some complex behaviours, but they do that through good foundations and building on those foundations. So we really need to make training as simple for them as possible. Thank you for your attention.